Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Express. This is the new Indian Express's weekly interaction with experts, where we analyze the impact of developments in our backyard and on our neighborhood, on India, of course. So do click on the new Indian Express website and tweet and follow Global Express. So I'm calling this session another brick in the wall, especially as Prime Minister Narendra Modi is heading to Johannesburg BRICs summit this coming week. That's August 22nd to 24th. Much is being made of the phone call from South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that is said to have changed the Prime Minister's mind over attending it virtually. The second intriguing development, I think, was the 19th round of talks between the senior military commanders from China and India at Chushul Moldo earlier this week to address the standoff in Depsang along the line of control after the Galwan clash that killed our soldiers in May 2020. But the anodyne statement that came out at the end of those talks belied my expectations that there was going to be a breakthrough that would prepare the ground for some kind of breaking of the ice between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There is a view that the lowering of the rhetoric could see a meet maybe on the sidelines of Joburg or at the upcoming G20 summit in Delhi in September, although I believe Xi Jinping hasn't yet confirmed his attendance at the event. The third thread to this discussion is India's rise. Much is being made this year of India being on a geopolitical high. It's seen as a pivotal moment for India because India has hosted a series of G20 meetings, the Quad foreign ministers, a Global South summit, the MEA's Raisina dialogue. Taking part in today's discussion on where India stands in this very confusing alphabet soup and what it stands to gain and hasn't are two of the country's top strategic analysts. Mr. Manoj Kewalramani, one of India's foremost China experts. He's with the Takshashila Institution, where he heads the China Studies Work Program and is chairperson of the Indo Pacific Research Programme. Welcome, Manoj Kewalramani. Also with us, who will be joining us a little bit later, is Mr. Harsh Pant, Professor of International Relations at King's College, London, and Vice President for Studies at the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. So let's start with you, Mr. Kewalramani. What is India's position in BRICs? And really, this, as I call it, this alphabet soup, the SCO, Quad, Global South, what does it really mean? I mean, India is chairing the United States-led G20. India is chairing the China-centered SCO. It's taking a claim to head the Global South. When somebody has told me that we should just call it the non-aligned Summit 2.0, what does it really mean? Has BRICs served a purpose? Has it run its course? Are we still a good fit? Because in a China-dominated group, even a mentor like Russia is reduced to a lackey.
Right. Thank you so much for having me for this conversation. Look, I think if you were to perhaps ask people in the MEA, they'd probably say that they're quite proud of this moment, that India is chairing so many different forums with so many different inclinations and with so many different members in a world that is increasingly polarized. And they would probably argue that this demonstrates India's position as a bridge, as a pivotal actor in the world today, and in terms of how the geopolitics is framed out. But I would sort of say that while there is a grain of truth to that, it's also quite difficult to be sitting on a fence when both the sides are continuing to drift apart further. It can be quite an uncomfortable situation.
The two sides, as in India and China.
As in the United States and China, and India is apparently on the fence. And now within that, of course, the fact that our own relationship with China has been extremely difficult for the last 6 years in particular, ever since Doklam in 2017. And that stress has continued to exacerbate despite efforts after 2017 to try and moderate some of the worst inclinations, at least, that were taking place in terms of that relationship. So we've seen attempts at informal dialogues, leader-level conversations, and of course, at the height of the pandemic, we ended up with the situation that we are in at Ladakh. So my sense is that as much as this year and India's chairing of all these different forums demonstrates that India is rising as an important global player, as a global player that matters, At the same time, it also demonstrates that India's position in terms of balancing its multiple interests and trying to find a sweet spot where its own interests of development and security can be maintained in a world which is increasingly getting polarized is going to be extremely tricky as the years go on. Specifically on BRICS, like you asked, last year the BRICS summit was held, and the Chinese and the Russians. If you look at the speeches by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and the speeches by then President Bolsonaro, Prime Minister
Yeah.
Modi, and Cyril Ramaphosa, if you read the speeches, what you will get is that while the other three were more concerned about economic issues, development issues, and the downstream impact of geopolitical events on economic and developmental issues, Putin and Xi Jinping were quite clear. They saw the BRICS as potentially developing into an anti-Western grouping,
Mm.
and that's the direction that they wanted to push it. So
Mm.
that again complicates what India's how the grouping would evolve and the kind of pressures that
Mm.
India would face in terms of the evolution of that grouping,
But
particularly given.
aren't we already facing that pressure? I mean, why did Cyril Ramaphosa, persuade Modi to come and attend the South African summit in person? Why was Modi reluctant? Was he reluctant because he would have been an outsider? I mean, what was it?
So I sort of I'm hesitating to see India as an outsider in BRICS, because BRICS is a grouping that works on consensus, and India is an equal partner in the grouping. It's just
But
that
we were brought in by Russia.
yeah, we were no. The grouping came in together in the mid 2000s. I mean, it was essentially a product of an investment banker's imagination, which led to the creation of the grouping, and obviously some political engineering by leaders on all sides. But the BRICS is not a formal grouping in that sense, right?
Yeah.
It's a strange grouping. It has tremendous meetings at ministerial levels and other levels, but there is no secretariat, there's no architecture, so it's not a formal grouping in that sense, right? So it's interesting in that sense. Also, the fact that it's a grouping that works by consensus. And an example of that is that last year, when Beijing seemingly wanted to push the idea of expansion, it was
Mm.
Indian hesitation which said that, look, we need to define parameters for why we get in new members. Other members are also interested in that sort of an argument. And I think over the last year, there's been an effort to try and identify parameters. I mean, the South African side has recently said that
So, what
they
would the
believe.
parameters be? I mean, there would it be political alignment, or what is it?
So I would be very skeptical. I mean, I think that Beijing and Moscow would be much more inclined towards political alignment, because they're given that they see politics as predominant, being the dominant factor in international sort of in the international arena today, as opposed to economics. The BRICS was
Mm.
fundamentally an economic grouping of emerging economies. So economics was the driving force. Along with that, obviously meant that there was a sense that these are countries that deserve to have a greater say in global governance. So to that effect, politics was a factor. But today, I think those sort of factors are being inverted, right? So today we are seeing, at least from Beijing and Moscow's perspective, politics being the primary factor, whereas from the other three, that's not necessarily the case entirely. So you're seeing this sort of identity crisis at the
So,
grouping level.
when you say politics is the driving factor, what exactly does China expect from? We know what it wants from Russia, but what does it expect from? I mean, the new guys who are coming in, the ones that they are pulling into the game, like Iran,
Hmm.
which is already part of the Belt and Road, and Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Argentina, which are all supposed to become members of the next BRIC summit in Kazan in Russia in 2024.
Hmm. Yeah, I think what China is interested in is expanding a grouping of like-minded countries that will agree and that will adhere to Beijing's propositions of the direction of global governance reform. Um,
I'm
it's
sorry, I forgot to
important.
mention Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's looking at a mass of countries which command significant size of humanity, significant economic clout, and also linked to that political clout that will move global governance reform in directions that is much more favorable from a Chinese interest perspective. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that even today, when it comes to the BRICS, I think if you were to double the GDP of all the other four countries, it would still fall short of China's GDP. So there's a massive
Hmm.
asymmetry within the group. You add more countries, you're not going to have countries which are, from an economic point of view, as vibrant, as dominant as Beijing is. So it feels that I think that it can sort of run roughshod on in the grouping, and it can at least push through its ideas of the direction in which global governance reform can take place. And then when you create these minilaterals or these larger sort of groupings which can articulate a certain position jointly, it can have an effect in terms of creating new standards, new norms for global governance. I think that's what Beijing's agenda is, and it wants to see these as not necessarily. It wants to push back against Western ideas of global governance, and
What would they?
therefore getting to
What would be the Western ideas, for example?
so, for example, if you were to look at the idea of human rights, and if you were to look at the idea of human rights linked to sovereignty, Beijing's view has clearly been that no state must interfere within how society is organized domestically within the territorial boundaries of any other country, right? So on human rights, it brooks no criticism. It's
Oh,
been able to generate a lot of that consensus. Now, when you get a group like this, you can generate further. Your consensus becomes louder. On trade, it would try to look at alternate payment systems, perhaps much more settlement of trade in local currencies, and things like
hmm.
that. So you try to sort of essentially de-Westernize your systems as much as you can, and therefore push for diversity in the international order. I think that's what this agenda is.
So that's already happening to a great extent because when India and the UAE did a deal, on phone pay and stuff like that, they decided that they would use an alternative method of,
So
not a
I
dollar, not a
yeah,
dollar run.
the
And
only word
since,
the only word that I would challenge in that assessment is great. I think it's happening to certain extents. For example,
yeah,
it's been more than a year to the war in Ukraine. India and Russia are still quite struggling to come up with a adequate rupee ruble
rupee
mechanism.
ruble.
I don't see why India and China would ever want to trade in local currency. I have no idea what China would do with
Our
$100 billion
rupee.
worth of rupees. So I think that there's far more challenges to doing this. But yes, we're seeing small steps in that direction where you're trying to find ways, alternate pathways.
You didn't answer the question I asked you about why India was reluctant to, actually physically attend the BRIC summit in Johannesburg.
So
What was it? I
So
mean,
I would be very skeptical if the prime minister was reluctant to actually attend. So I obviously I can't speak for what goes on, within PMO
yeah.
and within the mind of the prime minister. But my sense is that it would be very foolhardy to not attend physically, particularly knowing that Xi Jinping was traveling physically. India would not want to cede space in such a forum, which
Hmm.
can potentially, expand. And you don't want to cede space to Beijing and give the narrative to Beijing as a leader of the global I don't like the word global south, but of the developing world. You don't want to give them that narrative leeway because it has implications for yourself too. So therefore, I would be very skeptical of the idea that Modi was not thinking about traveling anyway.
Now, on the countries that China is pushing for, to bring into BRICS, these are also friends of India in the sense Iran has had a very long and historic relationship with India. So has the UAE, so has Saudi Arabia. In fact, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in recent years have become even closer to India than before. And Egypt, of course. And now, that Prime Minister Modi will be visiting Indonesia month. So these are countries that do have some kind of a a commonality with us as well. Would that not work to our benefit? Or and then that the other premise is that China and India are basically working at basically reducing each other's influence within BRICS. Is that a correct assumption to make?
So when it comes to expansion, I think that every actor in the group, and even without the group that is looking to enter the group, have very different reasons for wanting to be part of the group. I think Beijing and Moscow's views are quite clear, which are that they are looking at it as a geopolitical grouping where they want to get more countries along with them in what they see as their primary contest with the US-led West. From the perspective of, say, a UAE or an Argentina or a Saudi Arabia, I don't think that they have the same motivations. I think their motivations, for example, from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, I would assume that the motivation is largely being part of a dynamic large grouping where you can perhaps get some degree of trade connectivity, where you can get access to some degree of funding, although they're not necessarily short of funding, but some degree of funding.
That's
But
true.
also you get access to a new brand because Saudi Arabia is trying to reinvent itself, and BRICS is a different brand of an entity. And you perhaps get some hedging capacity with regard to the US, greater hedging capacity with regard to the US. Argentina would, on the other hand, look at a very different its interest profile is very different. It's looking at actually access to markets, it's looking at trade, it's looking at potentially access to capital, projects, expertise. So its profile is very different in terms of why it might want to be part of the BRICS. So I think that everybody has very different reasons. I think the Indian position is quite sane, which is that look, we're not against necessarily the expansion of the group, but it's worth thinking about on what basis are we going to get people in. There have to be certain parameters, there have to be certain principles. We must all agree on those parameters and principles. It can't be ad hoc political decision making. And what do these entities that enter the group bring to the group? So, for example, I don't think the BRICS has had tremendous achievements. To me, the brand is much more valuable than actually the outcomes.
In fact, I was
So
going to ask that question on what we've achieved. I mean, since 2009, since Yekaterinburg, what is it that we have got out of BRICS?
I
In
think we
specifically.
I think we've got significant. So, firstly, you've been able to raise your profile by being associated with, and again, we need to go back to the 2006 and 2010, and that time. It was the group became much more salient at a moment where the world was going through a global financial crisis. So it allowed you to raise your profile very soon. It allowed you to
Mm.
connect to different countries. It allowed you the opportunity to engage with these four other countries on a range of issues through a range of meetings, which allowed you to at least coordinate positions at a sort of meta level on issues that were of interest to you. So I think that to that extent it was useful. I think the fact that these countries got together and they did lobby for the 2010 IMF quota reform, which I think was significant. The fact that you've been able to set up a new development bank, which in
Mm.
8 years has just doled out $33 billion worth of funding. A significant chunk of that has come in India.
But there was
The
talk
fact
also of a new currency.
I think to me, the foreign minister, the Indian foreign minister, a month or so ago, quite categorically said that that's not on the table. And to me, I also think that it's a foolhardy idea. I mean, you're still struggling to arrange local currency trade, the common currency, given capital controls and so on and so forth, is really not on the table. But you've been able to achieve some things. Another big achievement has been the contingency reserve fund, which is
Yeah.
$100 billion. Countries have dipped into that pool. So I think that there have been useful outcomes, but it's not necessarily of the scale that the imagination that BRICS sort of generates. The imagination of the name of the BRICS today being this sort of alternative geopolitical force. I think that the achievements have been far below that. So the branding has been actually far better than the actual outcome.
That's very
When other
interesting.
when other countries do join, as and when they do, that's why parameters and principles are important, because unless the resource capacity of say the contingency reserve fund of the NDB was to expand, um, it perhaps will also take away from what sort of resources current members will be able to access, right? So expansion is therefore a much more complex process than just say a political decision, which is what Beijing and Moscow are looking at. And therefore, I think the Indian position is quite sane on this, that we need to come up with clearer parameters. The challenge is those parameters have to be agreed on consensus, and we haven't really seen anything uh, concrete reported in public. There have been media reports which talk about parameters like democracy, but then when I hear that, I say, well, who defines what's a democracy? Given the kind of world that we're today living in, where China calls itself a whole process democracy.
Hmm.
So it's a much more complex thing, and I think that needs to be worked out with tangible parameters, whether those are size of economy, whether those are scale of technology, any of those kinds of things. I think that needs to be thought through much more clearly.
So it's basically India's foreign policy, which is basically, it's all talked about, multi-alignment and strategic autonomy and all of that. How does that fit in with BRICS? Because I mean, the world is changing
Yeah.
rapidly as we speak. I mean, you have Russia, which is being reduced to a non-entity, and you have I mean, Where are we going with that? I mean, China has become very anti-India, in the sense it's blocked us from the United Nations Security Council. It's when even with the G20 wording is concerned, when we use the word Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the Sanskrit wording, that seems to have upset them. On terrorism, even though BRICS had announced would stand against terrorism, China put a block on that move in the United Nations Security Council. Said, so we can't mention Lashkar-e-Taiba slips out of the loop. The Mumbai terror attack mastermind slips out of the loop. So, and our foreign policy doctrine, I find, is a bit of a sham, don't you think? Or are we just hoping that nobody notices?
I think that what we're trying to do is, I don't think that there is any more attempt at balancing between the US and China in Indian foreign policy. I think India is decisively much more closer to the US, and India's relationship with China is decisively much more hostile. And it's likely to remain much more hostile for the foreseeable future. Unless, of course, tomorrow Xi Jinping wakes up and he has a change of heart, which I think is
That's
highly
not going to
unlikely.
happen.
Yeah. So I think that this is a trajectory that we are going to continue on, and I think India has become less shy about this.
Uh-huh.
I think India has become less shy about this. I mean, for example, the recent statements. I think it was a foreign ministerial level visit. But correct me if I'm wrong, with India and the Philippines, and the Indian side did talk about the Hague Tribunal verdict in the South China Sea. The Chinese were very annoyed about it, and this was a departure from what India has done in the past. So I think that there have been steps that have been taken. You talked about Vasudeva Kutumbakam being blocked. I don't think we should be surprised by that. We tend to keep blocking BRI and Xi Jinping thought in international documents also. So
Is
I
that
think that
so?
yeah. So so this is par for the course in my view. So my sense is
Yeah.
that look, we're part of these different groupings because we have interests which have congruence with the West, but they are not entirely aligned with the West. Um, you know, and that's why say for example we're part of the SEO. I'm not thrilled about it, but I can understand the compulsions of
We'll come back
why.
to SEO. I'm going to give you SEO in a minute.
Sure.
Mr. Harsh Pant has just joined. Welcome, Mr. Pant. Would you like to comment on this? I mean, the fact that we've been adept at playing both sides until now. I mean, how long can we run this charade? We're growing closer to the US, not taking a stand on the Ukraine. Some say it ups our value because, we keep a line open to Russia, and we're one of the few countries that can still talk to Russia. But once this chairmanship of the G20 and the SCO ends this year, China is unlikely to even allow us to become the chair of the global south. So there's one school of thought that believes that India and China are sabotaging each other at BRICS and SCO. Mr. Pant?
See, I think a lot of this is also about this particular moment in international relations. I think this is a unique moment in more ways than one, and I think it offers us enormous opportunities. So while we can go back to how BRICS was conceived. After all, we at one point in time, as a precursor to BRICS, were all, and we still continue to be part of what is called RIC, Russia, India, China trilateral.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea was that, look, America is too powerful a country. This is a unipolar moment in the US. And so, then Russian Russian Foreign Minister Primakov came out with this idea that let's all come together and challenge and at least put a brake on American unipolarity or burst the balloon of American unipolar moment. And I think India was very comfortable with that reality. India was getting closer to the US post-Cold War, but India was uncomfortable with what the French call hyperpower of the Americans. That we don't like a global hegemon who was dictating or throwing its weight around, and we thought that with China and with Russia we could balance it out. At that point in time, the logic was very clear that look, China of course is very big, but we could do it with Russia. Russia was in still many in India view Russia as an autonomous actor, and the idea was that with Russia on board, we could perhaps balance out China and balance out some of the harsher edges of Chinese foreign policy. And I think that then.
But we haven't really done that.
We haven't been able to do that, and of course because the world order evolved in a manner, and BRICS came up, and as I think Manoj was saying, some investment banking idea morphed into a geopolitical idea. It was always an artificial construct. One of my most famous articles is the BRICS fallacy, which I wrote long back, and it still continues to attract a lot of attention. But see, politically there was nothing there. How can you bring 5 disparate countries together apart from saying, and that was at that particular moment, look, these are 5 emerging economies. Today, who is emerging? I mean, out of these 5, only India seems to be emerging. China is stagnant at the moment, at least. Russia is nowhere in the picture. Brazil and South Africa have completely gone off the rails. So even in an economic sense, if the I don't think investment banking communities is coming back to these countries as a unit. So I think that luster is also gone. But what I think the leaders of these 5 countries were able to do, as Manoj was saying, were effectively build a brand around it. Now, for us, it was very, I think, interesting and convenient to be part of this camp, to also create our own space vis-a-vis the West. We were continuing to engage with the US, continuing to come to terms with the US, the reality that we have to get closer to the US. But I think these kind of platforms give us certain strategic space to maneuver, that we can always say that, look, we are continuing to engage with a large part of the world that may not be on West's radar. So therefore, for us, I do not think that it is such a bad idea to have legs or to have feet in so many camps. The problem will arise, and is already arising, when the international architecture changes and evolves as rapidly as it is doing today.
And also, Mr. Pant, the fact that China's economy seems to be taking a tumble. I mean, I just read that its economic growth has slid to 0.8% in the 3 months ending in June. And it says it's equivalent to a 3.2% annual rate, which could be among China's weakest in decades. So China's no longer the big daddy of BRICS, like it has, like it positions itself. I mean, India's economy has also taken quite a hit. Retail inflation apparently is at 7.44%, the 15th month high. So, I was looking at the economic benefits, saying, okay, the political benefits, China calls the shots, but the economic benefits haven't really accrued to India at the moment, has it?
And the reason, Neena, to me, it seems that I don't think India went into this thinking that there'll be economic benefits to India. I think India's position was always more informed by the larger geopolitical alignments that were shaping up. So yes, we were emerging powers. I think the idea was that let's band with these countries together and talk of global economic restructuring, that our weight is growing. So let's talk about global order, global governance, global financial architecture in particular, where we can demand a greater voice with a number of these countries banding together. But I think, that, and I think to a certain extent, we were successful. But the point is, when you reach a point where today, of course, the geopolitical contestation between US and China is so strong, and your own contestation with China.
Are we caught in the middle? Are we caught in the middle?
No. See, but our own contestation is so strong as well. So it's a two-way contestation we are trying to manage, and it's a damn difficult exercise. So what pre-2020 we thought, we could manage, we will stumble along. Let us see, there is a political framework, at least border is not so problematic. But today we are realizing all those parameters are on the margins. We have to virtually reconstruct a new normal, as they say, in Indo-China relationship. So the challenge, I think, is growing, and BRICS is becoming increasingly another of those platforms which we continue to say as observers of IR that, look, institutions reflect the realities of power politics at any particular point in time. And therefore, none of the institutions are working. Forget BRICS. I mean, even SCO, and you were about to talk about it. But if
I was
going
to get Manoj. Yeah, that's very interesting.
That was very, very, very targeted speech at SCO, basically saying that I don't think SCO is working for India. So that's why I said it's an interesting phase in international institutional frameworks and international order that way also, broadly speaking.
But I mean, Shahbaz Sharif then jumped in and said, you can't use terrorism as a cudgel for diplomatic point scoring, the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So in fact, Xi Jinping's doublespeak also was very interesting. So I basically was going to put the question to Manoj, saying that SCO is it going the same way as BRICS? I mean, it's going to be or even SARC, which is all but dead in the water. So I mean, just a verbal slugfest. What do we get out of it? Can I come back to you, Manoj, on this? Has it
Yeah.
brought any economic benefits to India being part of any of these groupings? But
So the
specifically
SEO,
SCO.
so the SEO was never really going to bring us economic benefits. I think from an Indian point of view, and Harsh should know this better than me, but from an Indian point of view, I think the approach was that you get into a grouping because your continental risk profile was changing as the US was looking to exit Afghanistan. Also, the Russians were very keen to get us into the SCO, and the Chinese were very keen to get in Pakistan. And you needed an outlet to sort of have greater connectivity dialogue with Central Asia. So to me, those were
Ah.
our primary objectives, as opposed to necessarily, you know, uh, looking at economic gain at all. To some degree, perhaps we've been able to at least be on the table at some of these conversations, but not even necessarily all. So, for example, a couple of years ago, the SCO set up a foreign ministers dialogue on Afghanistan, and India was excluded despite India
Yes.
being at the summit. So, and I think that was as clear a signal as you could get, as clear a snub as you could have gotten. So, I think that uh, because and as China sort of becomes a much more dominant actor in the Russia-China dyad, the SCO will move sort of far more in terms of hostility towards us. While the Russians want us to be there because we also play a role as some sort of a balancer against Chinese influence. I think with that dynamic changing, the SCO becomes a far more difficult space for us to be in. The BRICS, I think I would again look at it differently. I'd say that look, we're an equal partner there. We have an equal say there. We are, the second largest economy in the BRICS. So we have a far more significant say over there, and there is cachet for India as a sort of key actor of the developing world, which is not the case, say, with the SCO, right? And the SCO was primarily thought of as a military security grouping. And I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see the SCO also expand. It is expanding much more in the direction of a political alignment with China and Russia's perspective of their hostility with the US-led West, which I think complicates things for us far much more. And I think our ability to sort of intervene and stall progress in that direction is far more limited in the SCO as compared to the BRICS.
That's very interesting. Mr. Harsh Pant, what do you have to say to that?
I see. I think, I would say that, look, almost all the assumptions that we have been making about the global order have come under stress, right? A lot of the equations that were set during a time when economic interdependence was supposed to resolve all our problems, and that, somehow that is going to be the glue, somehow that is going to, evolve us into very mature nations where political tensions are not going to be the dominant frame of reference. All of that have been bypassed today. Every single aspect of national strategy today is dominated by geopolitics. Now, when that happens, you will have all of these platforms that were created at a particular point in time come under stress. Now, as Manoj said, SCO primarily from the very beginning was, the idea was to prevent American and Western entry into Central Asia. And the whole idea was, and from the very beginning, it was said, this is going to be a Central Asian NATO, or this is going to ensure that Russian predominance stands there. And Russia actually started this engagement. But today, China is the dominant player there. They have made Russia almost redundant economically in Central Asia. And for India, which is not only a maritime power but also continental power, having stakes in the kinds of conversations Central Asians are having among themselves is very important. And for us, Afghanistan was a big deal. So clearly, we went into SCO. We are in SCO for a different set of reasons, which have very little to do with economics. But increasingly, the issues of connectivity are becoming very potent, and we don't have connectivity. That's a disadvantage vis-a-vis Central Asia. So, and Chinese have. So Chinese are able to therefore dominate economically the landscape. But as I think we were discussing earlier, we are becoming much more and more vocal, much more open about the challenges that this is posing. So when Prime Minister spoke at the SCO, he did not only speak about terrorism. He also spoke against economic coercion. He also spoke against this idea of connectivity, but respect for territorial sovereignty, which was basically again directed at China. So he was saying that connectivity is all right, but don't bypass territorial sovereignty. So in a way, India is becoming more vocal about its priorities. And that is also something that Chinese are worried about. That look, in the past, it was easy to bypass Indian concerns because India was trying to, manage its ties with India, with China. But today it is becoming more difficult. Every single platform that you see today, SCO, BRICs, even bilateral platforms, China-India contestation is becoming much more visible, and it is a headache for, I think, a lot of the other countries. So it would be interesting to see how this pans out, because
in fact, if I can just ask, at Joburg, for example, there is a very strong feeling among China watchers, saying that there could be a possibility that Xi Jinping and Modi could meet as they did in Bali, and probably talk about maybe putting the border, cooling down the confrontation on the border. Do you think that is a possibility, or do you think that's just a figment of somebody's imagination?
Well, who knows? But Neena, but I think, and if anyone, you are the journalist, you should be knowing much more than we as analysts. But I would say one thing, that unless something is going on at the back channel level, which we are not aware of, it's very unlikely that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi will come out and do a very warm embrace of each other. I think
unlike Mahabalipuram.
Because that was, I think post that we have seen a very basic engagement between two leaders whenever they have met. And certainly all the indications, the last military commanders meeting that also did not reach any conclusion. But all the indications are that we are stuck, that there is a stalemate, that there is no progress on the ground. And so it would be very foolhardy for the Prime Minister to do something dramatic there. So it seems to me that if at all there is a bilateral conversation, it will be very, very formal, unless there is something else which is cooking. But by and large, earlier I was listening to the conversation, and I think between you and Manoj, and there was a sense that, look, unless Manoj mentioned this fact that unless Xi Jinping wakes up and has a change of heart. I think my problem is that even if tomorrow Xi Jinping changes his heart and comes to some terms, gives us some great agreement on a platter, I think the problem in the relationship is much more fundamental. The problem is that it is now not, that the trust has gone down to such an extent that anything that is offered to India with all right intentions will also be taken with a pinch of salt. And the contestation that we are in, whether it is bilateral, for allies, for partners, for projecting ourselves on the global stage, that contestation is not going anywhere in a hurry. We may even resolve our border dispute, but I think the structural issues in the relationship are so fundamental that I don't see this problem going anywhere. So while we, for the next two BRIC sessions or for the next two SCO sessions, we will get along. But I think beyond that, again, we will come back to these issues, because there is a fundamental disagreement on the kind of world order we want and the kind of world order they want.
That's a very good point. Manoj, do come in on this. I wanted to hear what you have to say, because, India has been prevented from patrolling from 26 of the 65 patrolling points on the Karakoram Pass. That's quite a deep ingress into India's territory. So you don't see any sort of softening of the stance by China to sort of pataw India and to agreeing to something or the other?
I think that if you think of it from a Chinese perspective, once you committed that original sin where you essentially lost Indian public opinion and wasn't political trust, like Harsha said, it's and part of that is because you believe that India is already leaning towards the United States, if not in that camp, and you see India's rise or India's growth and prominence within this Indo Pacific region as essentially an extension of American power. It becomes very difficult to offer carrots to try and settle things. Because to me, if one was to think of it from a Chinese perspective, if that is China's primary concern, then what is it that India can offer it to assuage that concern?
So isn't China's biggest goal to take over Arunachal Pradesh and Eastern Ladakh?
See, I would put the territorial issues in terms of what is. I mean, the Chinese have not told us the extent of their territorial ambitions, so we don't know exactly what they want to take over, and that's partly one of the problems, right? If they could share with us what their perceptions of the lines are, we can probably perhaps talk about resolving some of these things. And they have categorically refused to do that for a very long time now, which has essentially led to this SR dialogue mechanism not moving forward. In terms of what I mean, I agree with Harsh completely. In terms of what what I've even seen in Chinese discourse, in terms of what's come out of meetings recently, you had a meeting between Wang Yi and the Indian NSA.
Yeah.
Also, there was nothing different. I mean, the Chinese side has been very clear that look, you need to put the border issue as one aspect of this relationship and try to normalize the rest of it. Don't essentially stop trying to stymie us in doing what we are doing. And the border issue can remain as it is. We're not committing to resolving it. And India's position has been that, well, if you want the relationship to come to some degree of normalcy, you need to resolve the boundary issue. And I don't see any change from that.
So BRICS is the way it is. SCO is the way it is. What about G20? Now India is making a huge deal of the fact that it's hosting education ministers, foreign ministers, everybody in its and its aunt. So as a countdown now begins for the G20 summit in September, on the September 9th and 10th. It's not a hybrid event. Any leader who doesn't attend in person will not be given the chance to speak virtually. So that means President Putin, Russian President Putin, and Xi Jinping have to be there to take part in this. But this is where I find it very interesting. I mean, they've invited everybody. I mean, you've got the 19 countries which are already members. You've got EU coming, UAE, Egypt, the UN, IMF, ASEAN. What are we looking for from G20?
The only thing that I would say is that I presume Delhi would be quite a active, vibrant place with lots of arguments around Ukraine between the EU and Russia. But I think that beyond that, look, the G20 is beyond China, right? From an Indian perspective, it's about India's position in the world. It's sort of like a coming out party, not just for this government in terms of internationally, but also India's rise in India's sort of demonstrating that India has key propositions to make in regard to the future of the developing world and the future of the global economy and the future of global governance. So I think that from an Indian government point of view, from the Indian point of view, and from an Indian interest point of view, that's where we would like the attention to be. Of course, you can't ignore these elephants in the room. These are going to be there. I presume, and I'm sort of crystal ball gazing here, that whatever final communique that you have will clearly identify the fact that two countries did not agree to certain paragraphs on Ukraine. And I presume you'll get China and Russia being singled out in that context. My understanding has been that this entire process of negotiation through the Sherpas and through ministerial groups has been quite a frustrating process, particularly with the Chinese. With the Chinese, yeah, because there's been lots of unnecessary roadblocks, unnecessary interruptions, unnecessary delays, and unnecessary questions which the Chinese have raised at different points of time. And not just the Chinese, some other countries have also raised issues, particularly when events were being held in Kashmir, say, for example. So it's been, to me, it's been a learning exercise for this government in terms of how do you deal with a world which is so polarized and which is increasingly much more difficult. But the fact that we'll end up getting that summit and we'll end up getting a communique will be seen as a success, and to me, it's much more of a political statement about India's position in the world to be able to get all these countries together. At the last G20, India was instrumental in getting the final communique together. So I think this is more in that vein as opposed to necessarily just your competition with China. My sense is also that, and I would be very surprised if Xi Jinping were to not attend. I would be very surprised if he were to not attend. So my bet would be that he would attend. But yeah, that's what I would think.
Yeah, Mr. Pant, just to come back to you. So, I mean, of course, we have concluded there'll be no de-escalation, no disengagement, no deal between Xi and Modi. But what can can we look to maybe a leadership role of India? Maybe over the global south. Is that I mean, since if we don't have a say in either BRICS or in SCO, G20, as Manoj very rightly said, coming out party. what can we, where do we head? Where are we heading?
See, I think in a typically Chinese way, we are headed towards very interesting times. But but I think
That's a
G20.
curse.
uh,
Yeah.
but I think G20 process itself, I would say that, what you were mentioning earlier about the developing world or global south, whatever the term you want to use, I think that the sense that that has been the focus as far as India is concerned throughout the G20 process. And I liked one framing of it as somewhere, I don't remember where Dr. Jaishankar made this, that look, for India, the G20 has been a process whereby this has been an attempt to bring the world to India and India to the world. That, you can engage, I think, if you look at the, as you were pointing out, the great gusto with which India has managed the G20 process. I think the Brazilians who are taking over the leadership from us, they are in for a very difficult time because they can't replicate what India has done, taking G20 to small towns, to all the states in India, to almost making a festival of it, which we are very good at. And I think that itself is a message that I think to the world, that we are becoming much more global in our thinking, that we are not as insular, perhaps, as we used to be even a decade back. We are a country that is on the march, that sees all the opportunities that are available to the world, and where every person is engaged in this process, whether or not they understand what G20 stands for, but they understand that the world is coming to India, that the world wants India to do more. So I think that's a very interesting way of articulating India's position, which I thought is very helpful to understand why certain things have been done, which may seem very disproportionate to what the outcome perhaps may or may not be. As Manoj pointed out, we may get a communique, or which again might not be a joint communique. But I think that element of blurring the line between domestic and foreign for the domestic audiences and bringing the world to India. The other is, what you mentioned, Neena, is in terms of making almost the global south, the developing world, the fulcrum of our attention and the world's attention. So I think and it's a very interesting phase. Once India started talking of global south and G20 developing world, the food, fuel and fertilizer crisis, economic crisis, debt crisis, I think everyone latched onto it. You see the Japanese latching on to the G7 because they had the G7 presidency. They did the same thing. The Chinese, of course, have been talking about now the global south. The Russians did at their own Africa summit recently, where everything is about now global south. So I think the term itself is spot on. This idea that the great power contestation will be there, but are we forgetting a large part of the world that is not directly involved in it and that is bearing the brunt of this great power contestation? So in some ways, India has been able to articulate or set the global agenda, which I think agenda setting power is a very important power in global politics. And
so we seem to be running out of time. Thank you very much, Harsh, for that very interesting, conversation. And thank you, Manoj. I was also very curious about Modi going to Greece. And all this publicity that is now being generated about Greece being a partner, and how it's supported India. I had no idea that it was the first NATO country to send its defense minister to India after its nuclear tests. But wherever it goes, let's see how that pans out. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a fascinating discussion. I look forward to watching it all back again when I watch it. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, viewers. Do click on the New Indian Express website and continue to watch Global Express.